Simon Cowell, one of the greatest minds in television, the man who lit up the stage for millions of unknown voices. From an unremarkable mailroom clerk nobody remembered, he rose to become the most powerful figure in the entertainment world. With his almost magical ability to spot talent, he turned nobodies into legends, earning the title of the industry's golden eye. For over 2 decades, he defined what true television power meant, igniting millions of musical dreams and becoming the very symbol of ruthless standards and peak broadcasting. Simon Cowell, the genius mind behind American Idol, The X Factor, and Got Talent, the shows that gave birth to an entire generation of global superstars. But behind that legacy lies a story not glamorous, but devastating. A hidden battlefield of pain, broken health, endless loneliness, and tragedies that fame could never protect him from. The world has applauded his power for years, but few are prepared to face the haunting truth he now carries, wrestling with shadows so heavy that even his vast fortune cannot erase them. Before we begin, if those shows ever gave you faith, tears, or laughter, leave a like as a tribute to a man who sacrificed his life to ignite the dreams of others. Chapter 1. A childhood starved of light. Behind the thunder of global fame lies a cruel truth. Simon Cowell's first stage was not lit with dazzling spotlights, but with the cold, merciless silence of a childhood starved of affection. Born on October 7, 1959 in Lambeth, London, he grew up in the quiet town of Elstree, Hertfordshire, inside a family that shimmered with glamour from the outside, yet was fractured by wounds no one could see. His mother, Julie Brett, a former ballet dancer and socialite, seemed to glide through life with effortless elegance, her poise a remnant of the stage lights she once commanded. But that elegance came at a cost. She remained emotionally distant, her attention often elsewhere, her affection rationed like a rare currency. His father, Eric Philip Cowell, a stern music industry executive and property developer, measured success in discipline and achievement, but offered little warmth, his praise as scarce as a desert rain. Years later, Simon would confess with painful honesty, "My father never said, 'I'm proud of you,' even when I needed it the most." That single absence of praise, small as it might sound to others, became a lifelong scar, a shadow that followed him into every room, every stage, every silent night. It wasn't cruelty in the traditional sense. No raised voices, no physical harm, but a quiet, corrosive neglect that left a boy questioning his worth from the cradle. School offered no escape. At Radlett Preparatory School and later Dover College, he wasn't the star pupil his parents might have imagined, but the restless boy who broke rules, clashed with authority, and carried the shame of failing to meet expectations. His peers were remembered for their achievements, their confidence, their place in the hierarchy. Simon was overlooked. Class after class, he was the boy on the margins, present but unseen, restless but unheard. Scraping through with only a GCE in English and sociology, he left with not a sense of relief, but the crushing weight of disappointment. In his family's world, excellence was currency, and Simon felt utterly bankrupt of worth. By his late teens, rejection had become a familiar ghost, whispering the same verdict he had carried since childhood. "You are not enough." Out of pity rather than pride, his father secured him a position in the mailroom at EMI Music, placing him at the very bottom of an empire built on stardom. Each morning, Simon carried coffee to producers who never learned his name, sorted fan mail for artists whose songs filled arenas, while his own presence dissolved into invisibility. "I was invisible in a world obsessed with the spotlight," he would later recall, a confession that still stings with its raw ache. He left EMI once, too humiliated to stay, but the world outside offered nothing but more rejection. Doors slammed shut, confidence crumbled, and in despair he crawled back to the same mailroom he had once despised. In those days, Simon admitted, he would cry quietly in the bathroom after work. Tears not just of failure, but of the haunting fear that his life had already peaked before it had even begun. And yet, in the rubble of humiliation, a different fire began to smolder. The silence of his childhood had not destroyed him. It was hardening him. From neglect, he carved resolve. From rejection, he learned defiance. The boy who had once been starved of affection was slowly becoming the man who would force the world to notice. His childhood was no fairy tale. It was a crucible, and every withheld embrace, every unspoken word of love became the fire that forged his relentless, almost ruthless ambition. The boy who once wept in silence was about to walk into an industry as merciless as the childhood that had already carved scars into his soul. Chapter 2: The Mailroom Classroom, Learning Power in the Shadows. Armed with nothing but a stubborn will and the bruises of rejection, Simon Cowell stepped into the music world, determined that invisibility would no longer be the only story attached to his name. Humiliated yet unbroken, he returned to the mailroom of EMI, a place he once despised, where each stack of records and each unopened letter became his silent classroom. He studied not just music but power itself. How fame was packaged, how stars were created, and how dreams were sold. It wasn't brilliance that opened his path. It was raw grit, relentless persistence, and the refusal to let the verdict of not enough dictate the rest of his life. He watched the executives, memorized their rhythms, learned the language of hits and flops. He saw how a single song could launch a career, how a misstep could bury one. And slowly, quietly, he began to understand that success wasn't about talent alone. It was about timing, packaging, and understanding what the masses craved. The mailroom wasn't a dead end. It was a masterclass. By the early 1980s, Simon dared to risk everything. With partner Ian Burton, he launched his own label, Fanfare Records. At first, the gamble seemed blessed. With glittering pop tracks like Sanita's So Macho, Simon, the boy who had once been invisible, was suddenly visible everywhere. Hosting parties, clinking glasses, shaking hands with people who once ignored him, tasting for the first time the intoxicating sparkle of success. He was in the room where it happened. He was someone. But champagne can sour in an instant. The market shifted, trends withered, and the empire he thought he was building collapsed with brutal speed. By the decade's end, Fanfare was nothing but an empty shell. Its offices abandoned, its contracts worthless. Simon, barely in his 30s, was left with nothing but debts and despair. Friends vanished like smoke. Doors slammed shut. Creditors circled like vultures. The humiliation cut deep. He returned to his parents' home, retreating to the same childhood bedroom that once echoed with loneliness, a room that now whispered failure. To the world, it was a failed business venture. To Simon, it was a personal devastation, as if the little boy starved of affection had grown into a man stripped of dignity. Years later, he would admit with haunting honesty that time nearly broke me, recalling how he felt like a ghost haunting his own life, invisible once more. It was a cruel reminder that in the entertainment industry, triumph is fragile and cruelty is constant. Yet, in the ashes of that ruin, something fierce began to rise. The collapse of Fanfare did not end Simon Cowell. It reforged him. He began to study not just music, but the architecture of fame itself. What makes an audience fall silent? What makes them erupt in cheers? What makes them remember? Every humiliation, every sleepless night, every bitter taste of failure became the raw fuel for a man who would one day seize television by the throat and rewrite the rules of entertainment. His career did not begin with glamour. It began with ashes. And from those ashes, Simon Cowell began the climb that would one day make him both revered and reviled. A symbol of power whose empire was born not of privilege, but of pain. Chapter 3: The Comeback, Survival at BMG and the Birth of a Philosophy. Out of the ashes of bankruptcy, Simon Cowell stood at a merciless crossroads that would either bury him in permanent obscurity or force him to claw his way back into an industry that had already chewed him up and spat him out. Returning to the music business in the early 1990s was no triumph. It was an act of pure survival. At BMG, he did not arrive as a rising star, but as a man carrying the stain of failure on his name, whispered about in hallways as someone whose empire had collapsed before it had even begun. Every meeting was a reminder of humiliation, every handshake laced with the silent question, "Can this man really deliver?" Instead of being hailed as a visionary, Simon had to scrape for the smallest crumbs of opportunity. Swallowing his pride, he tore apart everything he thought he knew about music and rebuilt his philosophy from the ground up. Gone were the illusions of chasing timeless artists. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the pulse of the masses, realizing with painful clarity that critics did not buy records, ordinary people did. Later, he would confess, "I learned the hard way. Sell records first, earn respect later." A line that revealed how necessity reshaped his entire outlook. It was not glamour, but desperation that drove him to sign acts others sneered at. Pop groups like Five, ballad duos like Robson and Jerome, and boy bands like Westlife. Purists mocked them. Journalists scoffed. But their records sold by the millions. Each success was bittersweet. Triumph tainted by the scorn of an industry that dismissed him as cheap, even while he outsold their so-called stars. Yet behind those sneers, Simon was absorbing the cruelest and most valuable lesson of his life. Fame was never about perfection. It was about connection. He turned rejection into a compass, following not the approval of insiders, but the heartbeat of the crowd. Still, the road was steep and lonely. For every hit, there were endless nights of fear, and behind every chart success lurked the dread that another collapse could strip it all away again. He later admitted, "There were nights I lay awake convinced I would lose it all again," a confession that showed how fragile even his victories felt. But then came 2001, the year that changed everything. Chapter 4, Pop Idol, the birth of a television titan. Simon stepped out from the shadows of boardrooms and onto the blazing stage of television with Pop Idol. Many believed he was unfit for the screen, too blunt, too cold, too cruel to win over the public. But what they called cruelty, the audience called truth. His sharp tongue, piercing honesty, and refusal to sugarcoat failure electrified viewers weary of polite lies. Pop Idol became a phenomenon, and with it, Simon Cowell's face became as recognizable as the stars he judged. What began as a desperate second chance erupted into a cultural revolution, not just for him but for the entertainment world itself. From the humiliation of moving back into his parents' home to the spotlight of primetime television, Simon's journey was never a fairy tale. It was a war fought with scars, endured with grit, and won by daring to embrace what others dismissed. The path from fanfare's ruins to pop idolist triumph was not paved with glory, but with every rejection, every sneer, and every night of despair that forced him to reinvent himself. And that reinvention became the indestructible foundation of the empire he would one day command. Chapter 5. The Empire Expands: American Idol, X Factor, Got Talent. By the early 2000s, Simon Cowell was no longer the invisible boy in the mailroom or the failed entrepreneur picking through the rubble of bankruptcy. He had become the face of a new era in entertainment. Pop Idol had turned him into a household name. And when American Idol launched in 2002, the transformation was complete. Week after week, millions tuned in not just to hear aspiring singers, but to hear Simon's verdict. His cutting remarks, his raised eyebrow, his withering silences, all became as iconic as the performances themselves. What others saw as cruelty, audiences embraced as honesty, and soon he was the most talked about figure on television. By mid-decade, with the X Factor in the UK and Got Talent spreading worldwide, Simon Cowell was no longer simply a music executive. He was the arbiter of dreams, a man whose words could make or break lives in an instant. At his peak, more than 600 million viewers across 100 countries were watching formats stamped with his name. He was, as the press declared, the most powerful man in television. But power, as Simon discovered, carries a heartbreaking price. Chapter 6. The Cost of Power, Isolation and Controversy. The same bluntness that made him famous also made him despised. He was booed in public, ridiculed in tabloids, and painted as a villain by those who saw only the cruelty and none of the conviction. He admitted years later, "I knew people hated me, but I also knew I couldn't pretend to be someone I wasn't." That honesty built an empire, but left him surrounded by controversy. A king on a throne that tragically felt more like a prison. Behind the cameras, the schedule was merciless. Endless editions, live shows, global franchises, and the crushing responsibility of carrying entire brands on his shoulders. Nights disappeared into strategy meetings, days into criticism. Too harsh, too soft, too commercial, too predictable. The higher he climbed, the more isolated he became. The laughter of television audiences was replaced in his private life by silence. Success had filled his bank accounts, but it drained his sense of belonging. Friends drifted away, romances faltered, and the boy once starved of affection had become a man starved of peace. He confessed with raw honesty that even in the middle of filming, surrounded by lights and applause, I often felt completely alone. The cruel irony was devastating. The man who gave millions their moment of recognition often ended his own nights with no one to recognize him. And yet, it was in this tragic crucible that Simon's legend was sealed. He had not only reshaped television, he had redefined the relationship between fame and the public. For the first time, audiences felt as if they were sitting beside him, deciding who deserved stardom and who did not. The role made him polarizing, but it also made him unforgettable. At the height of his power, Simon Cowell had achieved what once seemed impossible. He was no longer invisible. The world could not look away. But the glory came wrapped in exhaustion, loneliness, and the haunting question of whether the empire he built had cost him the very things he had always longed for most. Chapter 7, 2013, The Scandal That Nearly Destroyed Him. When Simon Cowell first held his son in his arms in February 2014, the cameras captured a smile, but they could not capture the storm that little boy had silenced. Eric was not simply a newborn. He was a fragile miracle, a lifeline handed to a man standing in the wreckage of one of the darkest chapters of his life. Only months earlier, in 2013, Simon's carefully constructed world imploded when the news broke that he was expecting a child with Lauren Silverman, the wife of his close friend Andrew. It was not just gossip. It was a firestorm that scorched every corner of his reputation. Headlines screamed betrayal. Tabloids dissected every detail. And the man who had once controlled the narrative of countless careers suddenly found himself trapped in one he could not escape. Overnight, he was cast not as the master judge of talent, but as the judged. The betrayal stung deepest, not in the public's outrage, but in the quiet abandonment of friends who turned their backs, in the whispers that followed him into every room, and in the crushing realization that trust, once broken, is rarely repaired. Andrew Silverman filed for divorce on the grounds of adultery. And Simon, once the figure of power and certainty, longed only for invisibility. He later admitted in one of his rarest moments of candor, "It was not something I'm proud of. There were no excuses, no spin, only the heavy tone of regret." For a man who had built his empire on control, it was the most powerless moment of his life. Chapter 8, Fatherhood, Redemption in a Child's Laughter. And yet, from that same chaos came an unexpected rebirth. When Eric was born, the narrative shifted from scandal to salvation. Simon's world, once measured in ratings and revenue, suddenly revolved around tiny hands and bedtime rituals. The man who once barked orders in boardrooms now learned to read children's books in the quiet of a nursery. He swapped contracts for Lego towers, critiques for lullabies, and the cold glare of studio lights for the warm glow of fatherhood. He confessed later, "My priorities changed completely. My world suddenly wasn't about ratings or contracts. It was about him." Those closest to him saw it instantly. The relentless mogul who once crossed oceans for business now scheduled his life around story time, bath time, and the simple miracle of watching his son fall asleep. One associate recalled, "Fatherhood saved him. He was on a dark path even before the scandal. Eric gave him a reason to stop, to heal, to begin again." But redemption is never without scars. The scandal had left wounds that even fatherhood could not erase. The loss of friendships, the erosion of trust, and a guilt that lingered like a shadow in the silence between laughter and lullabies. Simon himself admitted, "I lost friends. I lost trust. But I gained something I never knew I needed." It was not a triumphant escape from consequence, but a reckoning he would carry for the rest of his life. The paradox was stark. A miracle wrapped in controversy. A gift born from ashes. To the tabloids, it was a scandal that passed with time. To Simon, it was a scar that reshaped him forever. What made his transformation compelling was its authenticity. It was not staged for the cameras or orchestrated by publicists. It was visible in the softened edges of a man once defined by sharpness, in the patience that replaced harshness, and in the humility that success had never taught him. Fatherhood did not erase the scandal, but it gave it meaning. The fire that nearly destroyed him became the crucible in which a different Simon was forged. Less arrogant, more vulnerable, more human. And perhaps that is why this chapter remains unforgettable. It is not the story of a scandal, but of how a man broken by his own choices found redemption in the most unexpected form, through the tiny voice that called him Dad. It is a reminder that even the most powerful are fragile, that mistakes carry weight, and that sometimes the light we need most does not arrive in spite of our failures, but because of them. Chapter 9, 2015, The Death of His Mother. In 2015, just as Simon Cowell was learning to steady himself in the unfamiliar role of fatherhood, life dealt him a blow that no amount of fame or fortune could soften. The loss of his mother, Julie Brett. She had lived to the remarkable age of 89, a graceful former ballet dancer who carried herself with poise even as age slowed her steps. To the world it might have seemed a natural passing, the quiet close of a long life. But to Simon it was devastation. Julie had been the anchor in a stormy childhood, the silent witness to his rebellions, and the one figure whose approval he always longed for, even when it was rarely spoken. When she died in July of that year, Simon was in the middle of producing The X Factor. Cameras, deadlines, and contestants suddenly became irrelevant. He stepped away, canceling commitments and retreating into grief that stripped him of the armor he had worn for decades. Yet the ache of losing his mother was sharpened by a wound that had never truly healed. Back in 1999, long before global fame, Simon had buried his father, Eric, a strict but guiding presence who never lived to see his son rise from bankruptcy to become a household name. For years, Simon carried that regret quietly, admitting that the one man whose approval he had chased the hardest never got to witness the success that need for approval had created. Now, with his mother gone as well, Simon felt as though the last thread tying him to the roots of his life had been cut. Friends recalled how fragile he looked in those days, a figure usually so unshakable reduced to silence. He once admitted softly, "Losing my mom was the hardest thing I've ever gone through." For a man who had spent his life chasing applause, the silence after her passing was unbearable. No spotlight, no success, no ratings victory could fill the void left by the woman who had been there since the very beginning. The pain was compounded by timing. Only a year earlier, he had embraced the miracle of fatherhood, holding baby Eric in his arms, as though the future had finally given him hope. Now that joy was shadowed by grief, as if life had demanded a cruel balance, giving him a son while taking away his mother. And yet, even in the heartbreak, there was transformation. Julie's passing forced Simon to confront not only mortality, but also legacy. He began to speak more often about family, about being present, about cherishing moments that fame so often steals. Those who worked with him noticed a new patience, a softness, a vulnerability that had rarely surfaced before. Behind the sharp wit and steely gaze of television's toughest judge lay a son grieving not just his mother but both parents, carrying the weight of regret and gratitude in equal measure. The loss did not break him, but it etched a scar visible in the pauses of his words, in the flicker of his eyes whenever their names surfaced. It was a reminder that even the most powerful man in television was, at his core, just a son missing his mother and father. Chapter 10, 2020 and 2022, The Accidents That Nearly Ended Him. In August 2020, at 60 years old, when many dream of slowing down and savoring peace, Simon Cowell was struck by a tragedy as brutal as it was heartbreaking. In the courtyard of his Malibu home, testing a powerful new electric bike, 1 second of miscalculation turned curiosity into catastrophe. Thrown violently to the ground, his back shattered in multiple places. And in that instant, the man who had built an empire on unshakable control lost all of it. He would later recall chillingly, I came within a minute of not making it. For a figure who had survived scandals, heartbreaks, and humiliations, this was different. It was merciless, a cruel reminder that even the most powerful are fragile when fate strikes. The injury was devastating. 6 excruciating hours of surgery, a steel rod implanted in his spine, and the terrifying verdict that one wrong movement could cost him mobility forever. For a man once defined by upright posture, sharp suits, and commanding authority, the irony was tragic. The titan of television, the man who decided the fate of countless dreamers, was suddenly confined to a hospital bed, struggling to lift a glass of water, unable to sit without agony. The lights and cameras that had always surrounded him were gone, replaced by cold monitors measuring breath and heartbeat, each beep reminding him of how close he had come to silence forever. He later admitted with no bravado, "The pain was beyond anything I'd ever endured." Nights became merciless marathons of torment broken by brief medicated sleep. It was not ratings or tabloids at stake now. It was life itself. And yet, the most heartbreaking pain was not physical. It was the thought of his 6-year-old son, Eric, a little boy who idolized his father, who clung to him with the unconditional love Simon himself had once craved in childhood. As he lay broken, Simon feared Eric might lose him too soon. "I thought of Eric, and I knew I had to fight," he confessed later. That trembling honesty revealed a man stripped of all armor, fighting not for empires, but for bedtime stories, Lego castles, and the chance to hold his son again without wires or scars. The recovery was cruel. Standing required assistance. Shifting in bed felt like climbing mountains. Entire seasons of television passed without him. For a man whose identity was control, absence felt like defeat. Friends described him as pale, frail, and hollowed by pain. And yet, they also saw something else, defiance. The same stubborn fire that had carried him from a mailroom to global fame. Slowly, agonizingly, he took his first steps again. Each one a triumph against despair. Eric became his greatest healer, cheering his father's faltering strides, reminding him daily of why survival mattered. But just as Simon began to reclaim strength, fate struck again. In early 2022, he suffered a second e-bike accident, this time shattering his arm and bruising his face. Though less life-threatening than the broken back, the humiliation was merciless, a cruel echo of his earlier fall. Once more he found himself in a hospital gown, stitched and scarred, mocked in headlines that called him reckless, fragile, even foolish. For Simon, the physical pain was sharp, but the deeper wound was psychological. The sense that destiny was taunting him, reminding him that control was always an illusion. To be knocked down once was tragedy. To be knocked down twice felt almost like a punishment. And yet he refused to surrender. Simon later admitted, "It changed me in every possible way." Both accidents became a mirror. He reflected on the reckless pace, the sleepless nights, the endless hunger for empire, and realized none of it mattered without health, without family, without tomorrow. Scarred but standing, he eventually returned to the public eye. But the world no longer saw only the harshest judge in television. They saw a man marked by mortality, softened by humility, sharpened by gratitude. Perhaps that is why these accidents remain the most haunting chapter of his story. Because in a single second, the untouchable mogul was reduced twice into silence, fear, and fragility. And yet from that silence he found a new voice, one not forged in ratings or power, but in survival, fatherhood, and the brutal, heartbreaking truth that even legends must fight, fall, and rise again. Chapter 11. The Face That Betrayed Him, the Cosmetic Crisis. By the time Simon Cowell entered his 60s, he had already endured a litany of scars, emotional, physical, and professional. But nothing prepared him for the cruelest wound of all. Not one carved into his spine by a bike accident, nor the grief of losing his mother, but one etched onto his very face. It was not tragedy by fate or accident. It was self-inflicted, born of the relentless pressure of living under the harshest light imaginable, the television camera. For years, Simon had dabbled in cosmetic enhancements. Botox here, fillers there. Each procedure justified as maintenance, a shield against the slow march of age. At first, the changes were subtle, even invisible to most. But as the years accumulated and interventions multiplied, the shield began to crack. By 2021, fans and critics alike stared in shock at a man who no longer looked like himself. His once expressive features seemed stiff, his trademark smirk frozen, his cheeks oddly swollen. Headlines blared. Simon Cowell, what happened to his face? Memes spread mercilessly. Online forums dissected every frame. And the man who had made a career out of judging appearances now found himself judged, mocked, and ridiculed. For Simon, the irony was brutal. He had built an empire on control. Controlling narratives, controlling talent, controlling television itself. Yet here he stood, unable to control the one thing most personal, his reflection. In later interviews, he admitted with uncharacteristic humility, "I went too far. There was a point I looked in the mirror and literally didn't recognize myself." That confession carried more weight than the tabloids ever realized. It was not just a cosmetic admission, but an existential one. For a man who had clawed his way from invisibility in childhood to omnipresence on global screens, losing recognition in his own mirror was its own annihilation. The emotional toll ran deeper than vanity. Simon began withdrawing from the spotlight. He reduced his appearances on America's Got Talent, skipped promotional tours, and allowed others to take the front seat in shows he once dominated. Insiders whispered that he looked tired, softer, almost diminished. The sharp sparkle in his eyes, the look that once terrified contestants and enthralled millions, seemed dulled. He spoke less of ratings and contracts, more of Eric, his young son. "I don't need to be everywhere anymore," he said quietly. "I just want to be there when Eric laughs." And still the scrutiny did not stop. Paparazzi trailed him on Malibu walks. Tabloids speculated about new procedures even when none existed. And every rare appearance was magnified under a microscope. For the first time, Simon understood in his bones what it meant to be the object, not the observer. The one on the stage, not behind the desk. The power had inverted. The judge had become the judged. Yet from that humiliation came something unexpected. Clarity. Simon chose to stop. He abandoned cosmetic treatments, vowing to let nature reclaim what needles had altered. Enough, he decided. Let it age. Let it show. It was more than an aesthetic decision. It was a declaration of peace with himself. He no longer needed to present invincibility. He needed to embrace vulnerability, and in doing so he became paradoxically stronger. When Simon eventually re-emerged, it was not with the gloss of artificial youth, but with the authenticity of a man who had survived public ridicule and chosen honesty over illusion. Fans who once mocked him now saw something different. Humanity. The once invincible mogul had revealed himself as fragile, flawed, and real. Perhaps that is the deeper legacy of this chapter. A reminder that even those who sit in judgment are not immune to the insecurities of age, and that the greatest courage is not in chasing eternal youth, but in accepting the truth of time. For Simon Cowell, the lesson was etched not in contracts or ratings, but in the lines of his face. And for once he was willing to let them stay. Chapter 12. September 2024. The death of Liam Payne. In September 2024, when Simon Cowell had just begun to imagine the autumn of his life as one of gentler rhythms, fatherhood, reflection, a slower pace, tragedy arrived with a cruelty beyond comprehension. Liam Payne, the boy Simon first encountered at 16, standing nervously under stage lights yet carrying a voice filled with unshakable promise, was suddenly gone. Not after decades of stages and sunsets, but violently at only 31 years old. A fall from a hotel balcony in Buenos Aires ended a life that had only just begun to unfold. The headlines read like fiction, but the silence they left behind was painfully real. For millions of fans, the news was shocking. For Simon, it was devastating in a way words could scarcely hold. Liam was not another contestant. He was not another star in a catalog of stars. He was family, the boy Simon had placed in One Direction, the band he carefully pieced together in 2010, a group that became a phenomenon and defined an entire generation. Simon remembered that audition. The nervous laugh, the flicker of determination in Liam's eyes. A simple yes had unlocked a journey that seemed destined to last decades. To see that light extinguished so abruptly, Simon would later say, was like losing a son. Simon knew loss. He had buried his father in 1999. He had laid his mother to rest in 2015. He had survived his own near-fatal accident in 2020. But this was different. Those earlier goodbyes, however searing, had come in the natural rhythm of life. Liam's death was unnatural, merciless. A young man ripped away in his prime with unwritten songs left hanging in the air like unfinished prayers. Too young, too soon, too cruel, Simon whispered to a close friend. And that more than anything was the truth of it. The world mourned in chorus. Cities glowed with candlelight vigils. Fans flooded social media with lyrics, photos, and broken words of disbelief. But Simon's mourning was solitary. Projects were halted. Cameras switched off. The man who once dominated global primetime chose silence. His nights were no longer filled with bright studios, but with quiet hours alongside his son, Eric. Friends noticed how he held Eric tighter, as if every laugh, every bedtime story carried the weight of something sacred. It was as if he was trying to give Eric every moment Liam would never get to give, one recalled. In private, Simon returned to the beginning. He replayed grainy audition tapes of Liam and the boys. So young, so full of untamed hope. What once felt like nostalgia became ritual mourning. Each laugh on tape was a wound, each song a ghost of what might have been. For the man who built careers and engineered culture, the helplessness was unbearable. He could design empires. He could create stars. But he could not rewrite this ending. And in that powerlessness, reflection took root. Simon began to speak differently. He talked not of ratings, but of legacy. Not of empire, but of family. Not of ambition, but of presence. The sharpness that once defined his voice softened, weighted now with the awareness of how fragile life truly is. Liam's death did not just grieve Simon. It scarred him. It became the mirror he could not avoid, showing him the cost of fame, the brevity of life, and the truth that even the brightest lights can be extinguished without warning. One Direction had been more than a band. It was youth, hope, unity. Now, with Liam gone, a piece of that symbol was shattered forever. The boy he once called his protégé was no longer here. And yet, in the cruel emptiness, Simon clung harder to what remained. To Eric, to the rare silences, to the simple and irreplaceable fact of being alive. For all the empires he had built, all the ratings he had commanded, nothing weighed more than the truth Liam's death carved into his soul. That life, unbearably short and unbearably fragile, is the only thing we can never replace. Chapter 13, 2025, The Man He Is Today. In 2025, Simon Cowell stands not as the ruthless figure who once ruled Saturday night television, but as a man utterly reshaped by survival, scars, and sober reflection. At 65, he still sits on the Got Talent panel, but the role is no longer about dominance. His verdicts have softened into counsel, his wit into warmth. The man once feared for his sharp tongue now speaks with the patience of someone who knows exactly how fragile life can be. Every word carries the echo of nights spent in pain. Every smile the shadow of trials endured. At home, his life tells an even clearer story. His $15.5 million Beverly Hills mansion, once a trophy of triumph, has become a sanctuary where health comes first. Mornings begin with slow, careful Pilates routines prescribed by therapists to protect the spine that fractured in 2020 and still punishes him with stiffness each dawn. Every careless movement risks reigniting agony. Meals are no longer indulgent feasts, but the product of meticulous plans with doctors. Low sodium to fight hypertension, high fiber to ward off diabetes, antioxidants to keep fatigue at bay. Every bite now feels like a choice between healing or hurting, a friend recalls him admitting. Yet his greatest trial is not the spine, but his eyes. Decades under stage lights and the lingering effects of trauma have dimmed his vision. Reading glasses are constant. Dim lighting leaves him squinting. For the man who built empires on spotting hidden brilliance in young singers, the blurring of vision feels like betrayal. He confides to close friends that the thought of one day being unable to see Eric's face clearly terrifies him more than any headline ever could. These physical wounds bleed into the quiet of his mind. Sleepless nights return often. Pain surging through his back like an old enemy. Anxiety lingers too. The fear of falling again. The dread of becoming dependent. Still, every evening all of this softens in the presence of Eric. Bike rides along Malibu's coast. Fumbling piano keys. Bedtime stories read with effort but with love. These have become the strongest medicine. Each laugh from his son feels like a promise. Each page turned like a defiance of time itself. And behind these domestic rituals, his empire still hums. Franchises like Got Talent and The X Factor continue to generate enormous revenue, sustaining a fortune now estimated at over $600 million. His portfolio is vast. A $24 million oceanfront mansion in Malibu where dawn breaks over the Pacific. A grand $45 million Holland Park estate in London. A Manhattan penthouse overlooking Central Park. In his garage sit more than 20 supercars. Ferraris, Rolls-Royces, Aston Martins, a Bugatti Veyron, though most now gather dust. A private jet, once a constant shuttle between continents, flies rarely. Symbols of a man who once raced against time. They now stand still, as if awaiting an owner who has finally slowed down. And yet, Simon speaks of these riches with detachment, almost disdain. He has already drafted his will. Eric will not inherit billions. Instead, the money will flow into foundations for children's healthcare, creative education, and scholarships for disadvantaged youth. I don't want Eric to inherit money, Simon has said. I want him to inherit values, and I want children who begin with nothing to inherit chances I never had. In this, he is not simply distributing wealth. He is rewriting the meaning of legacy. Even his appearance tells a story of surrender. The era of Botox and speculation is gone. His face is lined, his hair streaked with gray, his frame slimmer from discipline rather than vanity. I've stopped chasing youth, he confessed in a recent interview. I'd rather chase memories with Eric. Once mocked for cosmetic excess, he now wears his age with dignity. Each wrinkle a mark of survival. Still beneath the calm lies relentless struggle. The throb of his back when he sits too long, the blurred vision that worsens at night, the constant regimen of pills to stabilize pressure and pain. He knows that time is both a healer and a thief. But instead of hiding, he embraces it, turning fragility into gratitude. His projects now are about impact, not empire. Charity concerts, scholarships, creative incubators for young musicians. He appears on television rarely and only when it matters, speaking less of ratings and more of resilience. Perhaps the truest measure of Simon Cowell today is not in the millions earned or the global stars discovered, but in the ordinary victories. Reading bedtime stories under dimmed lamps, stretching each morning against pain, directing his fortune toward children who will never know his name. The ruthless judge has become the humbled mentor. The empire builder, a man of legacy. His life whispers a universal truth. Wealth fades, fame withers, health falters, but love, humility, and purpose endure. Epilogue, a legacy of empathy. Behind the legend, there is a father clinging fiercely to time. A philanthropist turning privilege into possibility. A survivor who teaches us that grace is not in triumph, but in endurance. And now, dear reader, his story turns to you. What lesson will you take from Simon's journey? To slow down before fate forces you to? To cherish laughter above applause? To invest not in possessions but in presence? Remember, Simon is not a perfect man. He has stumbled, misjudged, and been scarred in full view of the world. But perhaps that is what makes his journey worth reflecting on. It reminds us that legacy is not about flawless triumphs, but about the courage to change after failure, to love despite loss, to keep moving even when broken. Share your reflections below. Subscribe for more untold chapters. And join us in honoring not only the legends, but the fragile, imperfect humanity inside them. For in every scar, in every shadow, Simon Cowell shows us the ultimate truth. The greatest legacy is not empire, but empathy. Thank you all for watching the video. Thank you.